that don't really fit the message they're trying to sell. And there's
what the goddamn Holy Ghost
in the book
fucking
of Luke in the Syriac Aramaic.
What the goddamn Holy
Which you
Ghost
can download
fucking
this on
duck.
Google if you want. Syriac Aramaic PDF. It'll come up.
Jesus fucking
And they
Christ.
took these verses out of the Greek because Jesus is vehemently condemning the practice of animal sacrifice. And the other reason we know that Jesus condemned animal sacrifices is because we have many historians, early historians, saying that either Jesus condemned animal sacrifices during his earthly ministry, or that his disciples did, or his brother James did,
Stop
or
the
early
damn
Christians
game.
did. But it is this theme. Anywhere you see Jesus or his earliest followers, they were vehemently opposing animal sacrifice. Because they were saying God doesn't want death and murder and blood and violence to forgive sins. Jesus said, come out to the wilderness with me and be baptized in the waters. The waters will cleanse you of sin, and forgiveness and repentance will cleanse you of sin, not murdering animals. And so, as you can imagine,
Jesus
class who was making hand over fist didn't like Jesus calling out their Ponzi scheme and exposing them. And so they started going to Rome about it, saying, hey, we got this guy Jesus, can you please kill him for us? And they're like, hey, we don't get involved in Jewish business affairs. So eventually they had to prove to Rome that Jesus was a threat to Caesar, or the ruling establishment in Rome, and then they finally killed him. And it took them a while to convince them of that because Jesus wasn't a threat to them. But what he was a threat to was the priestly class of the day that was in bed with Rome. And so kind of by proxy, Jesus was threatening part of Herod's prophet scheme as well, because the main class of the day was called the Herodians. The Herodians were certain... Herodian is like a political affiliation, not to be confused with a religious association. So there were Herodian Pharisees and Herodian Sadducees. And these were the sort of like puppet priests that were appointed by King Herod, who would say, hey, look, I want a piece of that pie you guys got going at the temple, and so I'll make you guys a priest, an official priest. I'll decree you a priest if you give me some profits here. And so some of these Jewish priests were like, yeah, no problem.
Damn it.
And then he made a lot of those priests also be the tax collectors who went around
I'm so glad
collecting
you fucking
taxes
didn't
from
take
Jewish
that
people.
damn pony
So
from
they're
China.
like the ultimate betrayers of the day, right?
Suck my
They're like,
slut.
hey, you guys have betrayed your Jewish kin, your family, your homeland, to go be in bed with King Herod and the Romans and tax us, and you're not even real priests. So
Move, you whore.
early church historians say that the Jews wouldn't even allow Pharisee or Sadducee Herodian priests to enter the temple.
Suck my slut.
That's how hated they were. So there was a great schism between the mainline Jews, who almost all of them unanimously loved Jesus and his message. There's very few modern Jews of the day outside of the Herodian class of Jews that had a problem with Jesus, because he was just saying the same stuff that all Jews believe. Follow the commandments of Moses, turn away from sin, love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself, follow the 10 Commandments. Like they
Move, whore.
pick with him. Contrary to what Christians imagine, Jesus was not going around saying, I'm exclusively God. Worship me, confess me as Lord.
But Jesus did say, he that loveth
his
father or mother more than me.
That would have been the ultimate blasphemy for a person to say that. And of course, we know Jesus never claimed to be exclusively God, never told people to worship him, never told people to confess him as Lord, but rebuked people who confessed him as Lord on multiple occasions because they didn't follow the commandments. So Paul gets this airtime because he taught a very different gospel than that. He said you do have to confess Jesus. And when, anytime an empire adopts a religion, the religion always, in every case in history, ends up looking like the empire rather than the other way around. Empires don't have religions, right? Empires have one religion, which is power. And they will definitely use religion as a convenient way of centralizing power. But they're not like Emperor Constantine didn't have some kind of spiritual transformation that made him want to be a Christian. I mean, the history of this man He might have been one of the most negative
now fucking bring
humans who's ever lived.
Not right here.
After his conversion,
now stick my dick in that nice
pagan sun
twist.
worshiper before his conversion. And he changed the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday because he was a sun worshiper. And this is after his conversion he does this. Like, he just changed it to a pagan holiday. Like, what? Thought you were a Christian. He kills his own wife. I think he boils his wife in oil alive. He kills, I think, 2 of his sons. He kills tons and tons of people in the most gruesome ways. And you're like, yeah, I don't think that he was a guy whose heart was transformed by the gospel of Jesus. I'm not getting that feeling, you know. He was looking to centralize power, and he had a very difficult predicament of the day, which was the Romans were intensely anti-Semitic, right? They hated the Jews. They tried so many times to wipe them out and get rid of them, and they couldn't do it. There's too many of these rats. We can't get rid of them, you know. That's their
move.
So like, how do we control them if we can't get rid of them? So, well, there's this new Jewish Jesus movement religion that's capturing the Jewish world by storm, and it's growing rapidly by the day. And thankfully, we have a guy who was a Jew who went and preached the same religion as Gentiles, and he's out here preaching to all these Greek and Roman churches and places about this Jesus guy. So it's kind of like partially there's a pagan version of Christianity in the 4th century, and there's a Jewish version. And they're very separate from each other. You know, the Jewish Jesus movement, which was called the Nazarene Christian movement from the Essenes. Yep. They were called Nazarenes. Epiphanius says this in his writings in 300s AD, that before they were called Christians, they were called Nazarenes. Another word is Ebionites. Ebion was the name of the church, of Jesus' church.
God damn it.
And so they called themselves the Ebion, which means the poor ones, heralding Jesus' teaching on the poor. Blessed are the poor, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So the Ebionites/Nazarenes are the 2 names you're going to hear a lot in early church history for the Jewish followers of Yeshua. And then there was the followers of Paul, the Gentile believers. And so Constantine was like, we've got all this division between paganism and Judaism and this Christianity thing. How do we centralize this into one thing? And so they basically just said, all right, Christianity is our new religion. We're going to outlaw paganism and Judaism. And so they did that, and then about 40 years later, at 364 AD, at the Council of Laodicea, Pope Damasus made a decree that it's now punishable by death to be found practicing Nazarene Christianity. If you're in possession of a Nazarene text, you will be put to death. If you're found practicing a Nazarene practice, like observing the Sabbath, you will be put to death and your family. So they're giving the highest possible penalty for being a Nazarene Christian. I don't know about you, Amrit, but that's a bit confusing because wasn't Jesus a Nazarene? Yeah. I thought he was. Did I get that wrong? Wasn't Jesus a Nazarene? But you'll be killed if you're a Nazarene according to this new Christian church. So these are the obvious signs that the religion was a control device. And of course we know that it was because when Rome adopted it, they became even more powerful. And we have the Crusades and the Inquisitions and all the terrors we've seen in the name of the Pauline Jesus. It just couldn't be more obvious, right? That Rome could not have used Jesus' teachings as their religion. You can't create an army off of love your neighbor as yourself. When your enemy strikes you, turn the other cheek. Go the extra mile. Give your enemy your cloak and tunic. You can't build an army off that message. It's too damn loving. You gotta get some hatred and some anger and some heretics and evil people. Well, now, if you're only good by confessing Jesus, if you're only saved and atoned for in God's eyes by confessing Jesus, and everybody who doesn't confess Jesus, God is shipping them off right to the torture chamber when they die. So what does it really matter if we send them there a few years early? No, they're heretics.
Come on, you slut that slut.
If we can't convert them, we might as well speed up their journey to hell, kill them, get rid of them. We don't need more heretics on this planet. So you see how easy it is to rationalize evil under this belief system? If we're right and they're wrong, we can justify anything. And Jesus didn't preach a gospel of I'm right, they're wrong. You're right, they're wrong. We're in, they're out. Jesus told his disciples to go to every nation and preach the good news. Jesus said, I have sheep that are not of this fold. Jesus said, I leave the 99 to go after the one sheep who's lost. Jesus was clear that he wanted to do everything to save everybody from their sins. He did not preach an exclusive gospel.
Hi there, guys. I wanted to take a quick moment just to introduce
Come on, you
slut.
slut.
Poaching. It's something that I absolutely love doing. As you can tell, conscious conversation is such a massive part of my life. And having one-to-one, deep, meaningful conversations with people where I get to show up as your brother, or as the coach, or as your mentor has been such a gift for me personally, and a gift for lots of the people that I've supported on the journey of living a more spiritually empowered, spiritually aligned life. You don't have to take my word for it. Here's some examples of people all around the world that have experienced profound transformations through this coaching experience.
Amrit is a fantastic coach.
In a few sessions, he got to a depth that
Come on, you slut.
working with certain medicines.
He's gone through a lot of the struggles that you're probably facing, and Amrit's been a really strong, supportive figure in the journey.
In control of myself.
I'm kinder to myself. I actually have that vision and a
My
purpose.
spitster.
In control of myself.
I'm kinder to myself.
Oh,
I actually have that vision.
Oh, she's cute.
In control of myself.
I'm kinder to myself. I actually have that vision and a purpose.
I do feel like I'm a better version of myself already.
Suck my
Amazing
dick.
energy.
He was easy to talk to, which made me easy to trust him.
Working with Amrit at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning and really always down
Suck my dick.
Whenever I get off the call,
You suck
best
my
money we've
dick,
ever spent.
bitch.
I
You
would
suck
not
my
recommend him
dick.
because I don't want everyone to know about him and then I won't be able to book him.
You suck my... Not here.
Whenever I get off the call, best money we've ever spent.
I would not recommend him because I don't want everyone to know about him and then I won't be able to book him.
Suck my dick.
Yeah, my turn.
I would say absolutely.
There's no way you can work with Amrit for a period of time without being transformed.
So if you're considering him as a coach, do not hesitate, because you won't be disappointed.
Alright, so hopefully that's inspiring your evolution onwards and upwards. And if you are so inspired to evolve, you can book in a one-to-one call with me directly at www.amrit.coach.
You dumbass. Don't even think about it, slut. Suck my slut. God damn it. God damn it. Goddamn pwn. Fucking pwn. God damn it. You snot-eyed fucking slut. Come on, you slut. Come on, you whore. Come on, whore. You move, you whore. You whore. Come on, you whore. Move, whore. Fucking whore. Come on, you whore. Fucking whore. God damn it. Come on, you whore. God damn it. God damn it. God damn it. Suck my dick, bitch. Suck my dick, bitch. You suck my dick, bitch. Suck my fucking dick, bitch. You suck my dick, bitch. Suck my slut. Now suck my dick,
Amaret
bitch.
for a period of time without being transformed.
So if you're considering him as a coach, do not hesitate, because you won't be disappointed.
Alrighty, so hopefully that's inspiring your evolution onwards and upwards. And if you are so inspired to evolve, you can book in a one-to-one call with me directly at www.amaret.coach/life. And guys, if I can say so myself, I do think this is something quite special. Most people that I see building things online don't really work with people this deeply, this intimately, one-on-one as things start to grow, just because it is so time-intensive, and yet I'm so deeply passionate about the transformation that comes from one-to-one coaching that just isn't available anywhere else. It would be my absolute honor and a pleasure to support your spiritual awakening, your spiritual path, your spiritual unfoldment. It is my life's work. I look forward to seeing you in the call. Back to today's podcast. He's in this really interesting position where the Romans want to basically control the masses. And so was he intentionally planted, in your opinion, into creating a faith? Because there is, like, you mentioned this, like, he converts to Christianity at a certain point. But yeah, but he also doesn't really, like, you talk about actions, he doesn't really act out Christian behaviour at certain points as well. Like there's that particular point in the journey where he's been invited to like he won't eat with a particular Gentile Christians, but he will eat with the Jewish Christians, and the other disciples call him out for that. They're like, hey, that's not around. Oh, sorry, yeah, go on. Yeah.
Suck my dick, bitch.
Paul tries to call Peter out for eating with Gentiles.
Suck my dick, bitch.
It's so interesting, man. There's so many amazing rabbit trails we could take down the Paul
my dick, bitch.
vein, and we will. But one thing I want to say about Paul first here is that I don't believe Paul was all bad. I don't believe he was a plant. I don't believe he was an intentional deceiver. Not at all. I think Paul has a lot of good qualities.
Now,
Paul meant well. Paul wrote a lot of good things. I wouldn't say he wrote a lot of good things. He wrote some good things. Most of his writings to me are more or less just like confusing word salad.
He got goddamn fucking advantage. You son of a
really
bitch.
Intense.
Had I known that shit, I would
he talks about himself nonstop in his writings.
You slut.
And that's one of the ways that scholars know which epistles Paul didn't actually write himself, but his later disciples wrote in his name. He wrote some good things. Most of his writings to me are more or less just like confusing word salad, and really intense self-monologuing. Like he talks about himself nonstop in his writings. And that's one of the ways that scholars know which epistles Paul didn't actually write himself, but his later disciples wrote in his name, is that his use of personal pronouns is like exponentially lower. So they say he wrote about 7 of the 13 epistles in his name. Like, I, Paul, writing to you. Only 7 of those are actually written by Paul, and one of the easy ways to find out is personal pronouns.
Because that was
7 of those,
stupid.
There's Galatians, Ephesians, 1st and 2nd
Stupid,
Corinthians, Philippians, etc.
The stupid machine.
His use of personal pronouns is nuts. It's like 18 or 19 personal pronouns per 1,000 words. And when you compare that to the book of Hebrews, for example, it's like 3.3 or 3 personal pronouns per 1,000 words. It's like a 1,500% increase in personal pronouns. So
suck my slut.
He actually
I'm facing the ear. You're
pronouns
suck my
in the first
slut.
chapter of Romans than the entire book of Hebrews combined.
I just eared. You're
so there you go. Like, that's one way to know. Oh, this wasn't written by the same guy. And the other way to know is that when you're getting to Paul's organic writings, he's very flamboyant. He doesn't hold back his fantastical sort of Gnostic secret visions and secret mysteries, and he's word vomiting these at you, right? He is not holding back on what he believes on these things. End time rapture, Jesus will come in the clouds, a trumpet sound, caught up in the air. And then when you get to the other epistles that were written in his name, when you study the scholarship of it, it's very clear that his later followers are trying to really neuter him and domesticate him on these kind of embarrassing topics that were completely failed prophecies, right? Paul was very clear that he believed this whole fantastical event, which he called the arrival, by the way, was his name for it, the arrival of Jesus. He said it definitely was going to happen in his lifetime. He was very adamant that, this could be any second now. Jesus may come back. He told people, if you're about to get married, don't get married. Jesus come back any second now. If you're a slave, don't even worry about trying to get free, because it doesn't matter, because Jesus is coming back. He said, don't get a new job. If you need a job, just stay jobless, because Jesus is coming back any second. So he's telling people in his writings, in very real world scenarios, don't get married, don't get a job, don't stop being a slave, because none of it matters. Jesus is coming back any second now. And the trumpet will sound. We'll be caught up in the air. We'll be transformed into spiritual bodies. And he gets into this really dramatic kind of vision of this rapture event that never happened. So his later disciples are like, how do we just casually get rid of this from Paul's writings? And so they write in Paul's voice, and they repeat his ideas and his teachings, but they leave out all his rapture stuff, all his crazy, loony, end-time stuff, and some of his other teachings even about the ontological nature of Jesus.
Now,
was a little bit bizarre for them. Paul said stuff like, Paul would brag about his suffering a lot and say, I have filled up in my body the suffering that was lacking in the suffering of Christ. And you read it and you're like, whoa, are you saying that Jesus' suffering was incomplete and that you fulfilled it? Like you're like a second Christ, like Christ 2.0? Really weird stuff. So his disciples are like, we gotta tone this guy down a little bit, because people will be thinking he's crazy. And there's a lot of writings of people criticizing Paul from the historical context, looking back in time, being like, this stuff doesn't make sense. So it wasn't like it was easy for them to make Paul's gospel into a religion, but really they just had to pluck the main tenets of it, right? Which is salvation by confession and mental belief. You got to confess Jesus and say that you believe he was resurrected.
Jesus goddamn Christ.
And it's like kind of funny to consider the idea that Jesus would care more that we believed he was resurrected than follow his teachings. You know what I mean? On its face. So when you paint it out like that, yes.
Jesus.
And also, he told people not a few times, do not call me your Lord, and not do what I say. I don't know who you are, he said. But Lord, Lord, we cast out demons in your name. But Lord, Lord, we healed the sick in your name. And he says, not everybody who calls me Lord enters the kingdom. And he said, when I was hungry, you didn't feed me. When I was thirsty, you didn't give me a drink. So get away from me. Check this out. You who practice wickedness, he says. For when I was hungry, you didn't feed me. And then he says, away from me, go to where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth, which means suffering, right? So Jesus says, it is wickedness to confess me and not follow my commandments. And that's as clear as it gets, right? Don't call me Lord and not do what I say. And Christianity is basically the religion of calling Jesus Lord and not doing what he says. That is not an exaggeration to say that. And it doesn't make me happy to say it. I'm not cynical or in condemnation of Christianity at all. I love Christianity. I love the Christian faith. Like, if you only knew how much I love Christianity and Christians. I think Christians are amazing people with wonderful hearts for God, but it's the doctrines I'm criticizing. It's the way we've gone astray from the teachings of the Master. And I think, Amrit, I've noticed this kind of funny position that I inadvertently put Christians into when I have these conversations or debates with them. Since I've been posting this stuff, I get a lot of criticism from angry Christians who are very much like big Paul fans, and they don't like that I'm pointing out Paul's flaws and stuff. And I've noticed that I kind of put Christians in an interesting spot, because my only message, I just have one message. I'm not anti-Christian, love Christianity. I'm not even anti-Paul. I love Paul. He's a divine brother. I disagree with a lot of what he said, but I love the guy. And I admire the guy. My message is just this. Jesus' words alone are sufficient for salvation. We don't need anybody else's words. We don't need other hands in the pot of Jesus' gospel. We don't need to read Jesus through the lens of Paul or anybody else. Jesus' words only are good enough and should be the only words we actually follow. If we believe, and I certainly believe this, but everybody has to decide for themselves if they believe this, that Jesus really did demonstrate the true way to God and embodied it and taught it well. And his teachings do lead you to eternal life, the kingdom of heaven, knowing God within yourself. If you believe that, then you should say, okay, then I'm a follower of Jesus. And if I even think that somebody else's teachings might oppose Jesus's, I throw them out right away. That's how dedicated I am to Jesus. And it's like really hard to call that heresy. You know what I mean? And so like they will call me heretical, and I'll just be like, hey, just to confirm, I just want to know what you mean by that. You think it's heresy that I say we should follow only Jesus's words and not Paul's? And sometimes they'll say yes, because Paul, he revealed Jesus. He's almost, he's basically on the same level. But a lot of times they'll say, well, no, I don't think that's heresy, but it's what you say about Paul being a false apostle is heresy. Like, wait, but aren't you a follower of Jesus, not Paul? Why does it matter what anybody calls Paul? You're not a follower of Paul. And it's like, oh, I never thought about it that way. So it gets the gears turning when you point this out of like, why do we think we need other teachings other than Jesus's? Do we really believe Jesus taught an incomplete gospel? And then when you get into the topic of Jesus's 12 disciples who absolutely saw Paul as a false prophet and teacher and opposed him, then you have to ask the question, who do I think got Jesus's gospel more correct? Because it has to be one of the two. It can't be both, right? They disagreed with each other. They both repudiated one another. Paul, as we can read him in a second, bro. Paul literally calls the disciples of Jesus deceitful workers, false apostles, messengers of Satan, hypocrites, on and on and on. He did not like Jesus' disciples, and he didn't think they were legit. He fully believed that they missed Jesus. They couldn't hang with Jesus' real message or whatever.
God damn it.
But thankfully now, Jesus appears to me in secret visions, and he tells me his real gospel. So you've got to decide, every Christian has to decide, who feels more reliable as a source for the true teachings of Jesus. And it's like, would it not have been his blood brothers and his hand-selected disciples who walked and talked with him and were the first recipients of his message and heard him preach in person and suffered with him and bled with him and died for him, and they didn't get his message correct? But a man named Paul, who was a Pharisee Jew who never met Jesus, did get it correct. It's like, for me, dude, that's a hard sell.
Suck my dick, bitch.
From a perspective of the law of one, because you mentioned earlier that there's almost a law about apostles in that Jesus builds on Moses' work.
Because I lost my cord that stupid move I did.
But then you start to look at
stupid.
Paul doesn't really build on Jesus' work. There are some inconsistencies, and so the word apostle then comes into question in the light of apostate. But then also looking at it from the law of one, which I know you're that's you through and through in so many ways, brother.
Suck my
the light,
bitch.
and then also the
Suck
dark.
My dick, bitch.
Was Jesus' teachings too high vibe, too frequency that the dark just couldn't let it be?
Suck my dick,
I think
bitch.
During his day, absolutely yes. I mean, they liked their comfy, cozy, priestly class system of animal sacrifice.
Suck my dick, bitch.
Like, I don't know how much a goat cost in those days, but I imagine it wouldn't have been cheap, you know? It would have been probably something like the cost of a small car or something. It would have been something you'd have to save up for to get your family's sins forgiven, you know? So I think Jesus just ultimately was too much of a threat, and, you know, Jesus had two sets of teachings as well. He had his public teachings and his private teachings. And this is a very common teaching device of kind of ascended masters and sages who are very wise enough to know that if you're going to just go out on a street corner or just preach to people in public, and like, I don't know any of these people. I don't know where they come from, what their mindset is, what their beliefs are. I can only speculate, but I'm dealing with people from all walks of beliefs in life and different classes and stuff. So what are the safest and most effective ways to teach crowds of people?
Yeah, but Jesus said in secret have I said
and
done.
For Jesus, it was basically parables, right? And even Jesus said that. I think he says, to those who are inside the kingdom, something like the true teachings are given. But to those who are on the outside of the kingdom, everything is said in parables, Jesus said. To those who are outside, everything is said in parables. So that hearing they would be not understanding, and seeing they would be not realizing, or something like that. So he's saying, I teach in parables in public because there's a lot of people listening, that if I just came right out with it, and I'm teaching about oneness or something, and I just say, hey, God is one, you're one with God, everybody's one with God, we're all one together.
That's horse shit.
A good segment of that crowd may want to stone him for saying that. So instead of being like everything is one, Jesus is like, there was once a farmer who went out to sow seeds in his crop. He tells a story. And then he finishes his parable almost every time saying, he who has an ear to hear, let him listen. And that was Jesus' way of like, wink, wink, what I just said is a spiritual teaching with deep message and symbolism, but you've got to decipher it. I'm not going to translate it for you. And on a few occasions when he's alone with his disciples and he tells them a parable, and they ask him, he actually explains it to them and translates the parable for them. But he doesn't do that when he's in public. And the Gospel of Thomas, which many critical scholars believe is the oldest gospel we have, many critical scholars date it to about 50 AD, so just right after Jesus' death. It's a very ancient style of writing, and it was found at Nag Hammadi, as I'm sure you know, and it's just 114 sayings of Jesus. And I think 30% of those sayings are found in the canonical Gospels. So when you read it, you'll recognize a bunch of parables and teachings of Jesus from the canonical Gospels. But the other 70%, man, when you read the Gospel of Thomas, you're like, this is a deeply mystical book. The teachings of Jesus, they have that same frequency and style of teaching of like very direct, very succinct, a lot of metaphor and story, but deep spiritual truth being delivered. But they're extremely mystical and very Essenian, by the way. When you read the Gospel of Thomas, and it's kind of those deep esoteric teachings of Jesus, you're like, oh, these are Essene teachings from Essene manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls some of the time. In fact, I know you know this because I mentioned it in the masterclass I did, but in the canonical Gospels, brother, there are at least 6, arguably 7, exact quotes of Jesus saying an Essene creed, as quoted by Philo. Philo was a Greek historian who lived with the Essenes for, I think, 3 years and documents his time in extraordinary long detail. I mean, if you want to learn about the Essenes, you got to read Philo because he tells you everything you want to know about them. And so as he's describing the Essenes, he lists off all the different creeds of the Essenes. And, he says in one passage, it is the Essenes' first duty to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And, of course, Jesus in the book of Matthew says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Okay, that's not a verse from the Old Testament. That's not a Jewish verse we know of anywhere. The only other place we have a record of anyone saying that is these Essene creeds, right? And there's 5 more like that. Word for word, like don't call anybody on earth your father, for you have one Father in heaven. Do not swear any oaths, but let your yes be yes and no be no.
Stupid! And that was
you all just heard me say that, and many of you are like, oh yeah, Jesus said that.
Stupid.
Well, yes, but that's also an ancient Essene creed that Jesus was saying. So there's tons and tons of evidence that Jesus came from this Essene lineage. I think it had bifurcated a bit by his day in the first century. But when you get into the historicity of this stuff, especially the Battle of the Apostles, there's a shockingly satisfying amount of historical information to fact check and verify all of these claims that I'm making.
Talking about Jesus' heritage and lineage, James is...
Suck my dick, bitch.
I didn't know much about James until you started pointing out who he was and what he was up to in the world.
Dick, bitch.
Tell us more about James.
You suck
and
my
also,
dick, bitch.
Why was he so
now
obfuscated
fuck up and move this rope right here. I'll stick my dick
that
in
is
that
the
king's
question,
butt.
my friend.
Twist, you slut.
Can I share my screen?
I'd love it if you could, yeah.
I'll make it full screen. So this is the Religious Encyclopedia of Biblical History and Practical Theology. So this is one of staple religious dictionaries / encyclopedias in the world. And in this passage, this is the word Ebionites. Ebion, as I said, was the name of the Jerusalem church. They were called the Congregation of the Poor, and Paul mentions them by name twice in the book of Acts. This is what the Religious Encyclopedia of Biblical History says.
Fucker.
This designation was at first like Nazarenes, a common name for all Christians. Because remember, Christianity, what we call Christianity, was initially a Jewish movement. And only a Jewish movement. It didn't become a Greek or pagan movement until around the 60s AD when Paul starts teaching and traveling and gaining some steam, and then his disciples kind of really carried the flag for him after that. But Ebionites refers to what James, the brother of Jesus, and his 12 disciples, Peter, John, etc., Thomas, Philip, they were the Ebionites, the Ebion in the first century. That was the name of their church. So I want you to look at these 3 quotes.
You whore. Move, you whore.
Irenaeus, 180 AD. So this is 100 years after the disciples. Not that long.
Slut.
Those who are called Ebionites use the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew only and repudiate the Apostle Paul, maintaining that he was an apostate from the law. So this is a quote, a very specific quote, that the disciples of Jesus repudiated Paul as an apostate from the law in 180 AD. And these historians, Eusebius, Ambrosiaster, Irenaeus, Epiphanius, they had access to documents that don't exist anymore. And chronology, history, different scrolls and texts, and of course just the common knowledge of the day.
King Sullivan the fuck out of you.
At their disposal that we don't have today. So one of the kind of rules of scholarship is that you do have to take everything with a grain of salt and use a skeptical eye when you read things and make sure that, did this guy have an agenda for what he was saying, or does this check out? But beyond that, it's you should always kind of give better preference to the earlier writers, if that makes sense, because they're closer to the source than you are, and which means they have access to more documents and information than you do. So you kind of have to take them at their word a bit, because they actually were closer to living in that world. But what really nails the final hammer into the coffin is when you have multiple early historians all saying the same thing. Then you know that these people clearly didn't have some kind of individual vendetta. But on top of that, these are all Catholic scholars who are writing against the Ebionites, because remember, in 364 AD, Nazarenes and Ebionites, aka the first Christians, were deemed as heretics, and all of their texts were banned. That's heretical. Yep. So it's like we can't take the words of their critics as the most accurate representation of who they were because they're talking bad about them. But what we can do is see what are the basic statements they're making. And one of the reasons that the Catholic Church called the Nazarenes and the Ebionites of the first century, who again were the Jewish Jesus followers of his disciples and his brothers, they call them heretics because of this. Eusebius, 325 AD. These men, the Ebionites, thought that it was necessary to reject all epistles of the Apostle Paul, whom they called an apostate from the law, and they use only the gospel according to the Hebrews. Ambrosiaster, 366. This one's the biggest one, I think. The Jewish believers who nevertheless continued to observe the law of Moses denied that Paul was an apostle, because he taught that it was no longer necessary to be circumcised or observe the Sabbath. Check it out. Even the other apostles, that's Jesus's apostles, okay, there's no other apostles besides Jesus's. They mean other than Paul is what he means. The other apostles, the real ones, thought that he was teaching something different. That's huge. That's a huge statement. Somebody in the 4th century saying that the actual disciples of Jesus thought that Paul was teaching something different, and they denied he was an apostle. So getting back to James, the reason I brought that up is because James was Jesus' appointed successor.
I see a dick
James
in your
was Jesus'
future.
blood brother,
see a dick.
And many historians,
see a dick in your
Hegesippus,
future.
Eusebius,
See a
Jerome,
dick.
all mentioned that James was like super highly revered
See
by the
a
first
dick
Christians.
in your future.
And you can kind of
see
put
a
yourself
dick.
in their shoes, right?
I see a dick
Our Messiah,
in your future.
the true prophet
see a
Jesus,
dick.
got murdered by Rome.
Dick.
What's the next best thing we got? Well, it's got to be his blood brother, who Jesus pointed his finger at him in the Gospel of Thomas and says, "When I'm gone, you follow him." James the Just. And he says, "For whose sake heaven came into being." And when I read that in the Gospel of Thomas, I'm like, that's a weird statement.
Looks like I outsmarted the fuck out of him.
And what he means is that he's referring to a doctrine from, I believe, what does he mean by next best thing we got? Well, it's got to be his blood brother, who Jesus pointed his finger at him in the Gospel of Thomas and says, "When I'm gone," right? If our Messiah, the true prophet Jesus, got murdered by Rome, what's the next best thing we got? Well, it's got to be his blood brother, who Jesus pointed his finger at him in the Gospel of Thomas and says, "When I'm gone, you follow him." James the Just. And he says, "For whose sake heaven and earth came into being." And when I read that in the Gospel of Thomas, I'm like, that's a weird statement. What does he mean by that? And what he means is that he's referring to a doctrine from, I believe it's from the Talmud. It's been a while since I've cross-referenced this, but the Jews had a belief that there was a group of people called the Zadik, Z-A-D-I-K. And the Zadik were the righteous ones. They believed that there was always 36 Zadik on planet Earth at any given time, and that God makes sure there's always at least minimum 36 Zadik, or righteous ones. And it says, "For whose sake heaven and earth came into being," meaning God basically stays his hand of wrath from wiping out the sin-filled planet of people that don't follow God's law, only because there's 36 truly righteous people living on the planet, and they call them the Zadik. So it's like, these are the people that are the reason we're all still here. Like, they're so holy, they're so righteous, we should all be indebted to them and grateful to them. And Jesus pointed at his brother James and said, he's one of them. I mean, certainly Jesus was himself, but like, if he's one, it takes one to know one, right? And so what's really sad about the erasure of James, the brother of Jesus, it's like, I didn't know anything about James as a Christian at all. I had no clue who this guy was. Or that Jesus had blood brothers that were his disciples, you know? Is that James was a remarkably enlightened being who was a perfect example of Jesus in every way, and he was widely revered across Israel as being such, to the point that, I could be getting the names wrong, but it's either Jerome, Eusebius, and Hegesippus. All three different historians credit, Josephus too actually, the fall of Jerusalem, when Rome sacks Jerusalem and destroys the temple in 70 AD. They trace it all back to the wrongful stoning of James in 63 AD, I believe. James is killed by the false puppet priest, the Herodian priest, Ananus, because he's jealous of James because everybody hates the Herodian priests and everybody loves the populist priest, which was James. And it says James was the only priest allowed by the Jews into the Holy of Holies. I mean, take a moment to breathe that one in. It said James alone was permitted to enter the holy place and fall on his knees and beseech God on behalf of the people. They said, he was so righteous that his knees were like camel's knees because he was always on his knees praying to God. And 3 of these historians, and Hegesippus is writing in like 140 AD. So very less than 100 years, about 80 years after these events happened, that it was the death of James that started the Jewish revolt because they were so upset that they killed their priest, the people's priest, which was James, the brother of Jesus. And it caused such an uproar that King Agrippa deposes Ananus, I think the very next day or the following week, when he gets word of this riot that Ananus inadvertently started by killing James. And he's like, bro, what are you doing inciting riots amongst the Jews? We're trying to keep the peace with these people, and you're over here starting riots. You're done, bro. And he deposes Ananus, and now Ananus is in big trouble because he doesn't have the protection of the Herodian class anymore. He's out on his own. He's not a priest anymore. So Ananus, sure enough, gets caught by the followers of James, and they basically kill him violently, and they violate his body publicly and drag his carcass through the streets. That's how upset these people were over the death of James. So it's like when you can really put yourself back in the first century and put yourself in these people's shoes and start to realize, like, wow, there was a lot more enlightenment in Mary and Joseph's DNA than just went to Jesus. Jesus had a very enlightened brother who was seen by Jesus' earliest disciples and followers as just being slightly beneath Jesus in terms of his spiritual advancement. And so James, they had to erase James because James was the number one opponent of Paul. The book of James for millennia has been widely regarded by many Christian scholars as an open refutation of Paul's teachings, because Paul says faith alone is how you get saved. You cannot be saved with works, good works or nothing. James comes along and says, don't you know, O vain man, that faith without works is dead? And you're like, who's the vain man he's talking about? And of course it's Paul, because this was the explosive thing that I discovered, that I know you know, about the Dead Sea Scrolls, is that the Vatican scholars kept these scrolls secret from the public for about 40 years. They suppressed them, 43 years, I think, before scholar Robert Eisenman and Michael Wise went to legal battle over this, and they got the scrolls to be released.
God damn it.
And now real scholars can start digging into them. Because I don't consider somebody a real scholar if they have a huge bias they're trying to confirm, such as a religion. And that's the big difference with Christian scholars. It's not that they're not intelligent people or capable, but unfortunately they have a very big cognitive bias that they're trying to prove what they already believe, right? So critical scholarship is the only real scholarship, in my opinion. And when critical scholars, especially Robert Eisenman, got their hands on the Dead Sea Scrolls, they started noticing that a number of these documents, the Habakkuk Pesher, the Damascus document, Community Rule, are authored by the Ebion. And they're like, the Ebion, that's the name of the first Christians we know from early historians and sources. And the Ebion, all throughout these texts. Even some Nazarene also appears in them. The Notrim is the Hebrew word. So we've got texts saying they're authored by the Ebion and the Notrim, or the Nazarenes. And what are they saying? Well, these specific texts that are written by the Ebion, which we know was the name of the church that James led for 30 years after Jesus, they tell this interesting story of the Zadik, which was the title of James, right? In fact, James, nobody even called James by his first name, hardly. He was called by his title because he was on that level of, like, he's no longer just a person like you and I, like he's the Zadik, He is the righteous one. He is the teacher of righteousness. So he was called the Zadik, even by the historians that refer to him. So the Dead Sea Scrolls tell this story of the Zadik opposing a man who they call the spouter of lies and the law-free liar. They also call him the man of vanity or the vain man. So we have a Qumran-ism in the mouth of James, in the book of James, when he says, "O vain man, don't you know that faith without works is dead?" And in the Habakkuk Pesher, which is a Dead Sea Scroll written by the Evian,
Paul says that too.
They're using the very verse that Paul quotes from in his writings, Habakkuk 2:4, where Paul says, "The righteous shall live by faith," faith alone. And Paul changes the word there from the original Hebrew. The original word is faithfulness. The righteous shall live by faithfulness, meaning like devotion, being devoted to the law, being devoted to righteousness, being faithful to the law. And Paul changed it to faith as in a mental idea you agree with or believe in. So that in Habakkuk Pesher, it's probably James, I would imagine, or James's, scribes, writing this document, dispelling every single point Paul makes in his epistles, and calling him the vain man, the man of vanity, the spouter of lies, the law-free liar.
Bitch.
And then in the book of James, James calls this person the vain man and says faith without works is dead. And then Paul also uses the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac as evidence for faith alone. Wasn't Abraham justified by faith when he offered his son on the altar? And in the book of James, James says, "Oh, vain man, don't you know that Abraham was justified by his works? Because he actually did offer his son like God asked, and then God stayed his hand and God was pleased with him. Faith without works is dead." So you have this very, very obvious contention between James and Paul going back and forth. And we have it in the Bible. It's not like we needed the Dead Sea Scrolls. But oh my goodness, once we got our hands on these Dead Sea Scrolls, and we started reading what's in them and these very vehement refutations of Paul's teachings, you're like, oh, I see why they had to cover James up and kind of get rid of James. Because pretty much anywhere you read about James, he's opposing Paul. Especially in the Nazarene Gospels, by the way, which are called the Clementine writings. They have whole conversations with Paul that are pretty remarkable. There's one where Peter is talking to Paul. James actually sends Peter, and now you know why the Nazarene texts were banned as well, right? Because they're very anti-Paul. James sends Peter, and this is probably historically true because the Nazarene texts date back to at least 211 AD, which is much older than the canonical Gospels. And they're likely much older than that. That's just the first reference we have of these writings was in 211 AD. But these are very ancient writings saying that James sends Peter out on a kind of crusade to follow Paul around and refute him to his face in public in front of these churches. Because you can imagine the disciples were teaching, going around and spreading the gospel of Jesus, and Paul is following them around at every church, a few months later or years later, and he shows up being like, "Hello, my brothers, I am also an apostle of Jesus. And I come to preach the gospel of Jesus." And they're probably like, "Oh, cool. Yeah, some of your other apostle bros were just here. James, Peter, John. We love those guys. Come on in, man." And they welcome him in. And it's kind of funny because they almost every church Paul went to unilaterally rejected him. And when Paul first meets these churches, he brags about the way that they usually receive him with the hand of fellowship and they welcome him in. "You welcomed me in when I first came?" It's like, yeah, dude, because you told them you were a disciple of Jesus, and so they thought you were part of the crew. And then they hear you teaching, and they're like, whoa, this doesn't sound like the gospel of Jesus we know. And so they were probably sending these letters from Paul, which we have today as his epistles, probably sending them back to Jerusalem, and being like, "Hey, there's a guy here named Paul who wrote us these letters. Is this your guys' teaching or is this not?" And so you can imagine James and Peter and John writing letters back to these churches saying, "No, he's not our guy, and no, that's not Jesus' gospel." And so then the churches respond to Paul and say, "Don't come back here, please." And then Paul cries and bemoans in his writings, all the churches rejected me. Everyone in Asia rejected me. All the churches in Asia rejected me. It's like because the disciples were cleaning up his messes, right? So James sends Peter in the Nazarene text, in the Clementine writings, to go confront Paul, and they have these really amazing conversations. And in one of them, Peter's always like extending Paul the olive branch, and he's like, listen, man, we walked with Jesus, brother. We were his hand-selected disciples. We heard him teach. We witnessed his miracles. We suffered with him. You just need to humble yourself, my friend, and come and join us and learn from us, and we'll teach you the true teachings of our master. You can be what you want to be. You can be a disciple like us, but you got to do it the right way. You can't go make up your own gospel. And Paul responds to Peter, extending him the olive branch, and he says, basically in so few words, Paul's like, why would I follow you guys who only knew Jesus in the flesh? He's like, I don't know Jesus after the flesh. I know him after the Spirit. And Jesus speaks to me directly. So why do I need you guys? That's basically Paul's response to Peter. It's like, I know you guys follow Jesus in person, but I've spoken to him more recently than you have. And he told me his real gospel that you guys clearly didn't get when he was with you. And even in his epistles, he brags, like, I don't know Christ after the flesh. We don't know Christ after the flesh. I think it was Paul's way of kind of obfuscating the obvious elephant in the room, that he never quotes from Jesus' earthly ministry, his teachings. He never gives Jesus' earthly ministry any real credit, but he just says, look, the whole reason Jesus came here was to get murdered for our sins. And now he's the heavenly Christ, and that's all that matters. Forget about his earthly life. That was kind of Paul's MO and his aura. So he had this really extreme narcissism. I mean, imagine the narcissism to tell the people who followed Jesus in person that they didn't get his real message, but you did. Like, that's pretty intense narcissism.
Hi there, guys. I want to take a quick moment just to introduce you to my one-to-one coaching. It's something that I deeply love doing. As you can tell, conscious conversation is such a massive part of
I gotta go shit. I don't want to leave this hard dick on the fucking... You son of a bitch.
Part of my life, and having one-to-one deep meaningful conversations with people where I get to show up as your brother or as the coach or as your mentor has been such a gift for me personally, and a gift for lots of the people that I have supported on the journey of living a more spiritually empowered, spiritually powered, spiritually aligned life. You don't have to take my word for it. Here's some examples of people all around the world that have experienced profound transformations through this coaching experience.
Amrit is a fantastic coach.
In a few sessions, he got to a depth that I'd only experienced before.
Amrit is a fantastic
She's
coach.
cute. I gotta touch her head.
Amrit is a fantastic coach.
In a few sessions, he got to a depth that I'd only experienced before working with certain medicine.
He's gone through a lot of the struggles that you're probably facing, and Amrit's been a really strong, supportive figure in the journey.
In control of myself.
I'm kinder to myself.
I actually have that vision and a purpose.
I'm kinder to myself.
I actually have that vision and a purpose.
I do feel like I'm a better version of myself already.
Amazing energy.
He was easy.
Purpose.
I do feel like I'm a better version of myself already.
their
Amazing energy.
head.
He was easy to talk to, which made me easy to trust him.
Working with Amrit at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and really I was bouncing out of bed.
With to
Whenever I get
touch her
Best money we've ever spent.
head.
I would not recommend him because I don't want everyone to know about him, and then I won't be able to book him if he gets too busy.
Out of bed.
Whenever I get off the call,
With Amrit at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and really I was bouncing out of bed.
whenever I get off the call, best money we've ever spent. I would not recommend him because I don't want everyone to know about him, and then I won't be able to book him if he gets too busy. I won't get my turn.
I would say, absolutely.
There's
You
no
better
way
do something
you
about
work
that.
with Amrit for
About
a
that
period
thing.
of
I
time
would
without being
dump it.
transformed.
So if you're considering him as a coach, do not hesitate, because you won't be disappointed.
Alrighty, so hopefully that's inspiring your evolution onwards and upwards. And if you are so inspired to evolve, you can book in a one-to-one call with me directly at www.amrit.coach/life. And guys, if I can say so myself, I do think this is something quite special. Most people that are doing things online don't really work with people this deeply, this intimately, one-on-one as things start to grow, just because it is so time intensive, and yet I'm so deeply passionate about the transformation that comes from one-to-one coaching that just isn't available anywhere else. It would be my absolute honor and a pleasure to support your spiritual awakening, your spiritual path, your spiritual unfoldment. It is my life's work. I look forward to seeing you in the
That
call.
whore.
That's full on, and even just the way they're extending the olive branches, like Peter's MO, like you can just see it just there's so much Christianity in there, like there's so much of that.
Suck
Like,
my slut.
here's someone that's going about doing something that we can barely stand. Imagine it's like not the most palatable thing for them, and yet it's just like okay, like let's extend the olive branch. Come on into the fold. Come on into the fold. Come on into the fold. This guy. Come on into the fold. This guy. Come on into the fold. Which is again speaks volumes in the act of itself. Remember the actions. Like that's
Suck
really
my
profound.
slut.
Are you searching for something?
Yeah. Could you ask about the eating with Gentiles thing? Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. Yep.
Let me read the passage for your audience so we can see what really happened, because this is biblical evidence that about this schism we've talked about that proves like, because a lot of people say, well, those Nazarene texts, they were banned as heretical, so how can I really trust them? And my answer is always like, because the Roman Catholic Church called them heretical, which means they're definitely valid. You know what I mean? The most evil empire the world's ever seen called those documents bad. Those are probably the ones we should be reading. But I digress. They'll kind of say, well, I don't know if I can believe this crazy story that Paul and Jesus' disciples were enemies just from these, banned texts. And it's like, oh, great, you don't even need those. It's all over the Bible itself. We have plenty of evidence in the Bible. And this one to me is the greatest evidence. So let's read this passage that Amrit brought up a second ago from Galatians 2:6-14. So Paul says, "And for those who seemed to be important, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God is no respecter of persons. Those men added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, just as Peter had been to the Jews. James, Peter, and John, those so-called pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace that was given to me. When Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he was clearly in the wrong. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, "If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile, how can you force Gentiles to live like Jews?" So I've read this passage a dozen times growing up as a Christian, and there's at least half a dozen passages just like this where Paul's just absolutely blasting the disciples. I mean, here he calls them so-called pillars, whatever they are makes no difference to me. Just like no respect for the hand-selected disciples of the Master. And he calls it my message. This is another part of his narcissism, is Paul never once calls his gospel the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Doesn't refer back to Jesus.
But 6 times in his writings he calls it my gospel.
Makes sense when you're trying to bring the fire.
You dumbass. From China?
Because then you're like, oh yeah, that. Yeah, you didn't actually conflate Jesus' gospel with his own. Like, there's Paul's gospel and Jesus' gospel.
Well, my message, so you can say 7 times.
What a fucking dumbass.
You know, he's like, oh, those so-called pillars
from China.
They recognized the grace as soon as they saw me. They saw the grace of God on me, and they extended me the right hand of fellowship. It's like, well, they were doing what good Christians should do, which is greet you and welcome you in and be loving to you. Just because they were kind to you when they met you doesn't mean they recognized right away that I was the true apostle of the Gentiles. You know, it's like this very like self-induced, narcissistic vision of self that Paul carried, that he thought other people could see it too. Like, even the disciples saw that I was the real disciple to the Gentiles.
Okay, it's time to Jenna has Uzi arms him.
He starts to show
Jenna has Uzi.
Because there's a whole history to Paul with the disciples that I go into in the masterclass. Like this guy Paul, man, bless his heart. He wanted to be a disciple so freaking bad, and he wanted their approval so bad. Paul sort of bemoans the fact that the disciples would never give him letters of recommendation, which was the custom of the day. Of like, hey, if you're going to go around preaching on behalf of another group, you've got to have their letters of commendation, it's called. Where it's like James, Peter, whoever, saying, this guy Paul, he's one of us, believe what he says, he represents us. And if somebody doesn't have a letter of commendation, it's like, hey buddy, like, all good, like, we'll welcome you in, but like, we can't accept what you're saying until you give us a letter of commendation, so that we know what you're saying is verified by James, right? Who is, again, Jesus' appointed successor and blood. So it's like James is the ultimate authority, not Paul, in the first century, which is why they had to get rid of James.
Now, fuck up and read his bishop right here,
but Paul was rejected by the disciples because of his false teachings, and they considered him an apostate. In fact, in Acts, I think 15 or 21,
now fuck up and read this
before James
right here.
In the council, James accuses Paul of apostasy. The Greek word is apostasia. He says, we've heard you are teaching apostasia by teaching people to forsake the commandments of Moses. Is this true? And Paul essentially lies and perjures himself and says, I'll never do that, I'll never teach against the law. Because James basically says, okay, great. So just to prove to everybody here that you really do follow the law of Moses, we need you to take the Nazirite vow, which is a 7-day vow. You let your hair grow out, you fast, you don't drink, you abstain from all kinds of things. And so Paul is forced by James and the disciples to stay in the temple and perform this Nazirite vow in the sight of everybody, because all the Jews hated Paul. And like, this is an apostate. The Jews from Ephesus especially, they come and see Paul in the temple, and they're like, there's that heretic that came to our church. And they seize him and try to kill him. And James luckily intervenes and is like, hey, Paul, let's just send you back to Tarsus where you're from, because we don't want you here. And we want to protect you and stuff. So they send Paul back to his home country of Tarsus, which is kind of akin to being banished from the community. And after that experience of Paul being banished from the Jerusalem church, he goes on a bender and gets really upset against the disciples. And in his writings, his hatred for them comes out really strongly. And so right here, he gets a chance to show
with their smell,
his
suck my
superiority to the disciples.
So that's the context.
Suck my
That's the
slut.
context. And he's like, when Peter came, I opposed him to his face. And sort of
Smart!
kind of bragged to the Galatians here that, like, I'm more spiritual than Peter is. And look at what happens. He sees Peter eating with the Gentiles, and he's like, oh, look at Peter playing the hypocrite with the Gentiles. And it's like, okay, Paul, that's a projection. He's not playing the hypocrite because he's eating with Gentiles. He's showing love and camaraderie and brotherhood. He's saying, this is our master's teaching. We're all one. We should love one another, love our neighbor as ourselves. That's the one law we have to follow. So the Jews in the movement were probably eating with the Gentiles to welcome them in, and we're all brothers here. And Paul walks in on this, and he's like, oh, look, hypocrite over there, eating with the Gentiles. And he gets all high on his horse, and he walks up to Peter, and he's like, how are you gonna, if you're a Jew and you're living like a Gentile, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews?
Suck my
It's like, Paul, he's not living like a Gentile. He's just eating with the Gentiles.
Breaking bread.
That's very different than living like a Gentile. Like, he still follows the law of Moses. He's circumcised. Like, he's just eating with the Gentiles. And Paul gets his panties in a wad over it. And then the craziest